Good morning. I'm hoping everybody can hear me okay. I'm really grateful to be here this morning and to talk about not really knowing if I'm doing this correctly or if the things that I want to accomplish as a therapist are happening or not. So thank you so much for joining me this morning. So I want to start with talking a little bit about what is therapy. And the reason I want to start with that is because I think a lot of times, at least for me and in my work experience, I forget that it doesn't always have to be the very deep, dark, overwhelming stuff that really is therapy. So we've got a little diagram here of 4 things that kind of describe what therapy is. You know, it's a way to help people with a broad variety of issues. It can help eliminate some troubling symptoms so that people can function better. It's also a general term about treating mental health problems by talking with a mental health provider. Sometimes it can be where a person can learn about their condition, their moods, their thoughts, their feelings, or behaviors. And I liken therapy in a lot of ways to, as a therapist or a clinician or a provider, whatever term you prefer, to being a teacher of sorts and helping people to make sense of things that at times feel very nonsensical. And I imagine that there are folks who can relate to that because I know that I can as well. This is something that in working as a clinical supervisor and also helping folks who are beginning to do this kind of work, it's important to remember, or maybe just to know, that not every therapeutic interaction is going to be deep psychotherapy. Okay, so it's important to also know that things like life skills and helping someone to learn how to pay bills or modeling for them the appropriate way to behave in a situation, that is therapy as well. So let's try this. Okay. I'm hoping that everybody can see the slides. I heard there was a little bit of a mix up there, so I'm hoping that you guys can see that all right. Okay. The other thing in my work recently as a clinical supervisor is, I don't know, I probably won't ask my family or people who know me to kind of support this, but I sometimes don't always set realistic expectations for myself. And yeah, go ahead. And it's really valuable to have some realistic expectations. And sometimes as a therapist, I have to have realistic expectations. And if I don't, it's not super helpful for the clients that I'm working with to be able to have realistic expectations. So I apologize. It seems that we're having a little bit of technical trouble with the slides. And I'm thinking that I'll just keep going and we'll figure out this other stuff on the back end. I also remember, and I've heard people talk about, like during an internship, I remember working with a couple, and they came in and said, okay, so how much time is it going to take you to help us figure this stuff out? Because, you know, we've got things to do. And I remember as a brand new therapist thinking, well, I don't know that I can give you a particular time frame because I don't even really know anything about you yet. And so helping to have some more realistic expectations on what we can do is really critical. And, you know, I think a lot of us can relate to wanting things to be the way we want them to be. And life doesn't always do that. So the other thing about therapy is, I think sometimes people think that it's not as much of a process as it is. And it's really the relationship between the client and the provider. And I have joked with clients over the years that there have been times when I have not appreciated something that my own therapist has shared with me. And in the moment, I really didn't like it. And yet, after some time, I was able to recognize that it was probably the nudge that I really needed in that moment to move forward and to not stay stuck. And being an active process, there are things that are uncomfortable. There are things that sometimes can be really, really valuable and helpful. And having someone witness sometimes that we've had a success or a struggle or something hasn't gone well can be so validating for folks. And not everybody has grown up in a system in their family where they have been validated for some of their experiences, and they say, well, I just feel crazy. And one of my favorite questions from one of my first clinical supervisors is, well, how do you define crazy? Because you may have a different definition of that than I do. And if you can help me understand your definition of it, then we can figure out whether or not you are crazy. So this also brings into the conversation that we have to be mindful of what we're bringing into a therapeutic relationship. And I'm not sure if you guys can see the slide. There's a slide here. No, our slides just aren't working. So maybe you guys can just kind of look at me and imagine. So as a therapist, I am a person, and I sometimes don't have a great day. And I remember a time going to see a therapist, and I had run into her. I was coming out of the bathroom, and she had mentioned that she had had a really horrible experience on the way. I didn't know that she was my therapist at the time. And then whenever, this was my first session, went in and found out she had just shared with me something horrible that had happened. So Lila's going to help from the side over here. That's okay. She'd shared something horrible that had happened. And then whenever I went in for a therapy session, she apologized. And for me, what that really did for me is it helped me to really recognize that she's a person. I grew up in a family where both of my parents were teachers at the local high school, pretty small town. And sometimes people didn't always recognize that I didn't know where my parents were at all times and what we were going to be doing that day in chemistry. And so when this person really was real with me, it helped me to recognize that everybody has issues and everybody has problems. And I didn't feel so much like I was crazy or a freak, but that it's something that I needed some help with. And I don't know if any of you who work as therapists or maybe have gone to therapy struggle with asking for help, but I'll tell you, I'm going to be one of the first people who's going to want to help somebody else. So this next slide, which I hope that you guys are being able to see now, is mistakes are part of life. And I think about how, as a therapist, if I'm working with someone and I make a mistake in the session, because that is very, very likely to happen, and if I ignore it or act like it's not a mistake, I'm essentially modeling some, I'm not being authentic. I was going to make up a word there, but if I can be authentic, and if it's possible for me to look at a mistake or a situation not so much as a failure, but as a learning opportunity. Because when people are first learning to set boundaries, let's say, we sometimes will want to kind of be in this sweet spot in the middle. And if I've never set any boundaries and I'm trying to figure out how to get here, I sometimes swing way over here and then have to sort of find that place in the middle, or that middle path, like they talk about in the Buddhist tradition. So it's important to be forgiving of our own mistakes. I think a lot of us work really hard with clients and the people that we're working with to encourage them to be forgiving of their own mistakes. And yet, if we don't model that for them, it's like, well, it's, good for you, but not for me. And so I think it's really helpful. It also gives people an opportunity to experience someone who may be in a position of power apologizing or owning up to having made a mistake, and that is something that can rupture a relationship in the moment, yet we can also work to really repair that rupture. And isn't that how a lot of relationships are? You know, as we're getting to know people and what they like or what they don't like and how they make sense of things, we sometimes step on somebody's toes. And clients will sometimes do that with us, and we get to decide when and where we may sort of share with them that that's a little too close, or maybe that's not appropriate for what we're talking about right now. This leads into the importance, at least from my perspective, about vulnerability. And I think probably a lot of folks have heard of Brene Brown and a lot of her work on shame, fear, and vulnerability. And I think it's really critical, at least for me in the work that I do with therapists learning to be therapists, or with clients who are learning how to be human, to not be afraid of being vulnerable. And Brene Brown frequently talks about how being vulnerable is oftentimes the bigger strength, or, you know, if we're willing to dare to be real and authentic and vulnerable, that's oftentimes where our power is. And there's something about creating a space where a client can come in and they can be vulnerable with us. And if we can reflect that back, or, you know, share that we are witnessing that they can feel seen and heard. And that's, for some people, not something that they've experienced in many of their relationships. And it can be really scary. And sometimes people will retreat from having been vulnerable, or, you know, kind of step back and say, well, you know, that's not really something I want to talk about. And we can kind of recognize that and then come back to that at some point down the road. One of the things that I like to also think about is I worked with a therapist who used to have a stuffed animal of Curious George in his office. And sometimes people would ask, well, why do you have Curious George here in your office? And he said, because it helps me to remember to be curious about things. And if I come into a session with someone with some curiosity, or encourage you to come into a session with curiosity, we can look at things not from a judgmental sort of a place, but be curious about something, or want to know a little more without that judgment. And sometimes that curiosity is how we can then learn that, oh, okay, this is what was going on in that moment. And curiosity can be really difficult for some of us with our own stuff, but not so difficult with other people's issues. I really love this picture, and the words talks about the importance of adopting positive habits as a therapist. Listening, observing, noticing. I love that there's the one word kind of instructions here. Breathing is one of the big things, at least in my experience, because I have a tendency over my life to hold my breath when something gets a little bit uncomfortable, or I'm not really sure. And so I oftentimes will notice that first in working with someone. And my question is usually, are you breathing? And frequently clients will say, well, Elaine, I'm not, and you know it. Another client had said, well, it's an automatic thing. I don't really think about it. And then they're like, but now that you've asked me, I think I'm not. And so helping people to recognize that it's really difficult to do this work. It's difficult for the clients, and it's difficult for the providers or the therapists, because we're learning how to be in a relationship where we're not just talking with a friend about things. We are helping to untangle sometimes years of maladaptive coping or cognitive distortions, and stopping and really pushing the pause button can prevent them, maybe just for a minute, to not be beating themselves up, or, you know, just being completely and totally hard on themselves for things that they didn't know how to do in the moment. It's important to take risks. I think as a therapist or as a provider working with clients, it's important to take risks. And sometimes those risks may result in, like I mentioned earlier, when a therapist said something to me and I did not like it in the moment, sometimes being willing to kind of push the envelope just a little bit and to kind of say, well, I'm curious, we've talked about that previously and you did it this week again, what was going on, and kind of pushing it just a little bit to see. And it's been my experience that with working with supervisees and also working with clients that sometimes they'll push back and sometimes they won't, but we can also kind of come at it from a place of being curious and learn more about our motivations, which is oftentimes what we're assisting somebody with learning how to do, is what is it that drives my behavior or my thoughts. Becoming friends with failure. This is a difficult one. If any of you are similar to me and a bit of a perfectionist, and you want things to go well, and you want things to be right, and you want them to be perfect, reframing that it's never a failure, but it's always a lesson. And every situation has an opportunity, or could be a chance to learn something new, maybe about myself, maybe about the importance of the boundaries in this relationship, this therapeutic relationship, or maybe not answering a question that I could have done that differently. One of the many things that's been really helpful for me in my work as a therapist and supervisor is owning when I make a mistake, or if I say or do something in the heat of the moment that is not okay, and identifying that, what, that was a mistake, and you got to see me be human. And sometimes I give myself 10 or 15 mistakes to make in a day. My hope is that I don't make all 10 or 15 in one session with one person, but then I get to practice really being compassionate and vulnerable with myself and finding some additional supervision. In thinking about working with people, I find that it's so incredibly important to be human. And I think particularly over the past year, with everything that's been going on and so many folks who work in mental health who've been essential workers and have been working consistently throughout the past year of everything happening, that we are human and we can continue to learn. I continue to struggle at times with Zoom and doing meetings and things online. And other times I don't struggle as much. It's really critical, I believe, for us to adopt a mindset of growth. And being open to learning from our mistakes will help us to grow not only as a counselor, but also as a person, because there are times when talking with someone, I will frequently encourage them to say, well, what if we take your work hat off for a moment? And what if you speak to this person sitting across from you as a female who grew up in a particular area of the country and had similar or very dissimilar experiences to this person sitting across from you, and wanting to learn more about their own experience. I think here's an opportunity for me to be human. I believe that this next quote on the slide is not actually supposed to be a question. John Kabat-Zinn said, you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. And I think sometimes, particularly with cognitive distortions or when people are having issues with wanting to resort to old behaviors, sometimes it can be helpful for them to sort of surf that urge rather than actively engaging in that behavior. And sometimes it's not, because they may not have the ability to kind of just ride that wave out to the other side without engaging in those behaviors. So we can't always make everything go the way we want to. And our clients sometimes want to know, so how can you help me to make my husband want to do the dishes? And boy, I think if anybody knew how to do that, there would be a lot of happy spouses out there. So I think I talked a little bit about this a few minutes ago. When we do allow ourselves to be authentic in sessions, we are opening ourselves up so that we can grow and learn and also connect with some of our own strengths. There's also the mirroring that happens. I hope that many of you are familiar with Bruce Perry's work and the importance that he talks about with kids who learn by kind of watching and experiencing the adults in their lives, how they deal with things, that kids will sometimes learn to make sense of situations. Thinking about how sometimes if a child falls and scrapes their knee, and before they've decided if it hurt or not, they're kind of looking at the adults around them to see, okay, what am I supposed to do now? Am I supposed to just get up? Or do I, collapse on the ground and, just everything is awful? And it kind of depends on what we're taught, that we all do make mistakes and that we can continue to get back up and look at, okay, maybe don't take such a big step next time, and recognize that sometimes those scars on our knees can remind us of times when we learned that smaller steps will get me there maybe as fast and hopefully without as many scratches or bumps or bruises. I'm going to talk about some of the things that I think can be really helpful in working with clients, and also recognizing our own parallel process in working with clients. I think in a session, or either an individual session or a group session, if we focus on the places where either you as the provider or the client are struggling, that's really sometimes where the growth opportunity is. I know that sometimes it's really nice to give somebody a lot of kudos and to really talk about things that feel good, and yet that doesn't always help someone or help the therapist to know how to manage a situation that could be really difficult. There's a TV show that I remember watching not long after I finished graduate school called In Treatment, where Gabriel Byrne is a therapist, and I believe one of the clients he was working with was a teenager. And she was noted to, she started out on the couch and then she sat on the floor and then she moved to another place. And what I loved about watching that interaction is each time she moved, he moved in response to her. And it really struck me. I think that he didn't want it to really feel like he was sitting, really high above her. He wanted to really be on her level. And then it was almost like a chess match, that she would move and then he would move. And sometimes people don't really have the awareness that we're doing that, or maybe they do. But if we shift, it might help them feel more connected or in tune with them. And I think about how sometimes somebody will be talking about something that maybe I've been encouraging them to think about, and it's almost like you can see the light bulb go on, and I frequently will lean forward, and sometimes the people that I work with, or their eyes get big and they're like, why are you doing that? And I'm like, well, I'm really excited because you're saying something that we've been working towards. And then they get really excited and think, okay. Of course, if they're young adults, they roll their eyes and think, oh, what are you doing? So feedback. So this is something that I think is really, really critical. And sometimes people have talked about how I had a really horrible first session with somebody and I just don't think that we're a good fit. And what I want you to think about is sometimes getting negative feedback really early in the relationship, working with a client, is not always a bad thing. If this person feels comfortable enough to let you know that something doesn't feel okay, I feel like you may have helped to create a safe space for them. You know, not everybody is able to come in and be really assertive about what they want or what they don't want. And sometimes they, you know, can share feedback with us, and we may have our own kind of unconscious bias that we're not even thinking about. As a therapist, you can validate these concerns, make some adjustments, do things a little bit differently, and really foster the openness. Because it could be that somebody shares feedback with you and you're thinking, wow, this person really knows what she wants or what he wants. And you find out that's not something that they've ever done before. And yet they may be willing to try something really new and different. I think it's also really difficult in the moment. And yet I think people sometimes don't always think about how a therapist does sometimes, frequently, I'll speak for myself, think about the clients that we're working with in between sessions, coming up with ideas and sometimes replaying what was said or what was done, and would I do something differently next time, and then bringing that up in the next session. Um, you know, balance, keeping the client engaged. If they're not going very fast, maybe we don't push them. You know, the window of tolerance is really, really critical, and helping people to recognize that feeling uncomfortable is very different from feeling overwhelmed. When someone feels uncomfortable, maybe because they've received some difficult feedback, that may be the learning edge where we can take some information and learn more about ourselves and how we are showing up in a session and make a decision about doing something different. Again, there's that balance and the give and take in the relationship. Being willing to change things up and reconnect or rebalance is really critical, because sometimes people have not had the opportunity to be able to say, hey, I don't really like this, but you know, maybe we could do something a little bit different. I know sometimes having the honor of working in a place as beautiful as Sierra Tucson, we don't always have to do a therapy session or even a supervision session in the office. Sometimes walking around outside can be quite helpful. And for some folks, that feels a lot less intimidating for them. And they will sometimes share a little bit more. And most of the time, I don't generally walk right across from somebody where I'm kind of looking at them, but I'm usually next to them, kind of like when you're driving a car and you can sometimes have conversations without somebody feeling like you're intensely connecting with them and trying to see into their soul. This is something that Babette Rothschild talks about in her 10 tips for trauma therapists. Being with a client and in that same space with them, I think is a really sacred space. It's not something that you can do with somebody or do to them. And it's one of the ways that we help people to learn how to connect interpersonally. We have to be open to developing and establishing some trust. And once that trust is there, then there may be techniques or specific modalities that you may want to use in conjunction with the client so that they can continue to grow. One of the things that comes up here at Sierra Tucson is people will frequently come into treatment and want to go straight into trauma processing with EMDR. And our providers frequently spend a lot of time educating people that we have to have a good foundation of resources before we can jump in to all of that processing. And I frequently encourage people to think about how, if you don't know how to swim, it's probably not a great idea to go down off the high dive in the deep end and jump, you know, into the 14 feet of water, but maybe learning how to float and then being able to kind of right yourself if things get a little wonky, rather than just jumping straight into the deep end and really getting overwhelmed. And yet sometimes people are really, really focused on, but I've only got this much time, and helping them to see that being with themselves is part of the growth. And I think that goes for therapists as well as clients. Being responsive. You know, this study in 2012 I thought was really interesting and a little bit disheartening. They found that recovery rates of individual therapists on the issue of being responsive and kind of changing, a situation, in the moment, can range anywhere from 23.5% to 95.6%. And I feel like this really goes well with being in the room and connecting with someone rather than doing something to them. I mean, when I go to the dentist, I want the dentist to do those things that they do to make sure that my teeth are going to be there into my 80s and 90s. I don't want them just to sit and talk with me. But when I go to see a therapist, I would rather be able to connect with and have someone reflect back to me the things that I'm bringing, because I don't always have a good sense of kind of how I'm coming across in the moment. Attunement. This is something that is something that some folks just seem to naturally pick up on. This is, we talked about, or I talked about a few minutes ago, that folks really want to feel seen and heard. They want to feel like the person that they, carved out time in their schedule to spend some time with to help them figure out some things really gets them and can understand where they're coming from. And developing that alliance is also one of the big reliability predictors of the outcome of therapy. Sometimes it could be similar to watching, I don't know if you guys have ever watched any of like poker tournaments, and I chuckle when I see folks in these professional poker tournaments with their hats or their sunglasses or all these different things, and people have a tell when something's going on. And I think that is something that as a provider, we can share with our peers or with our clients, because sometimes our body has held on to things, and it does sort of communicate to the people around us that something's going on. Maybe I don't know what it is, but our body does oftentimes remember those things. You guys probably have heard the old adage that practice makes perfect. And I remember somebody telling me that there's no such thing as perfect with humans, and that practice really makes routine. And I think about the deliberate practice of showing up and being present and connecting with somebody. It's a lot of work, and some days it might be a little bit less work than others. And here's another diagram. It talks about the importance of finding your performance edge, having a plan for yourself, executing the plan, and then evaluating the plan. Doesn't this sound like a treatment plan? How we identify what are the things that I want to work on, what are the things that I'm really good at, what are the things that I'm not so good at that I want to improve upon, what are the things that are going to help me to be more helpful to the clients that I'm working with, but also for myself, because I'm growing as a person, as a therapist, just like my clients are. When we focus on mistakes or errors and then make some small improvements, this is something that can also be really helpful for us and for them. Observing, we talked about some of the body language, remembering things that people say. This is something that sometimes I think clients are very surprised by, that we as therapists sometimes remember some of the details of things that they don't always remember having told us. Correcting something and then adjusting over a long period of time. In much the same way that we are observing, remembering, correcting, and adjusting with clients, we're also doing that with ourselves. I remember one of my first videos in my internship. This was we had to videotape ourselves in a session. And the way I had set the camera up, I was wearing a pair of sandals, and I had my leg crossed, and I was, swinging my foot. And I had to show this video in class, and the only thing that I could focus on was that my foot was swinging throughout the whole session. And I didn't even remember or pay attention to any of the other things that I was doing or the things that were going on with the client. And that was really helpful feedback for me, because I was so judgmental of myself and, thinking that I wasn't listening, and then learned that, well, maybe you were trying to self-soothe by just kind of doing some kind of movement because you knew you were being watched, you knew other people were going to see this, and you wanted to be on. And that's something that I think, clients do as well, and therapists do. We're always learning, even when we don't want to, which is hard. I also like how this work, I think a lot of people get like a master's or a PhD in science or arts, and it's an art. I think there's a feel to this kind of work more so than a particular technique. I think there are techniques that people use, but I think oftentimes it's about that connecting with someone and developing with them, and then practicing different skills and adjusting them based on the information or what's going on in that moment. I also find that this next part is a little bit difficult. Sometimes beginners can do better than people who have a lot of experience, because they're at their learning edge and are oftentimes so excited to try something that they are sometimes a little bit more open to doing something a little bit scary or a little bit risky than somebody who maybe has been working with a particular client for a long time or has a particular way of doing things. And it's just really funny how sometimes people who maybe don't have as much experience really, will just jump right in there. And sometimes it goes well, and sometimes not so much. So, that sort of sweet spot of discomfort where you can continue to learn and grow and develop, versus having old skills and techniques and just kind of doing the same thing every day. I think, isn't that the definition of insanity? Doing the same things and expecting different results, because we are always learning and growing, even when we maybe don't want to. I think I heard a client say that recently. That is pretty much it, and I am curious if anybody has any questions that we can talk about a little bit. I know that as a therapist, we frequently doubt ourselves, or maybe I'll speak for myself. We doubt ourselves and don't always see that self-doubt that we have is something that some of our clients may pick up on, that may be a mirror that they're holding up for us as well. Let's see. Hold on one second. Okay. So I'm curious if we've got any questions here. Let me figure out how to do this. There we go. Okay. So let me, again, like I said, technology is lots of fun and sometimes quite helpful to, all right. All right, so you can hear me just fine. That's good. Okay, I think hopefully the slides did come up. All right. Okay. here's a good one. This person is talking about how sharing about being vulnerable, and how difficult that is, and finding that sort of that place in between that. And I think this is a really good question. Where's the boundary between being authentic with self-disclosure and oversharing? And I think that's like a lot of things. Boy, it would be nice if it was a very black and white sort of an answer where we could say, okay, this is it. And there may be some things where that is really black and white. And other times it may be more about, I can really relate to that struggle of being in a relationship where you don't feel seen and heard, and being able to talk about not really valuing myself and learning how to recognize my value, and then being able to request that same sort of value from other people, and seeing that I can make mistakes. And sometimes people have talked about, they've shared something with a client and then they're like, oh man, that is not something that I wanted them to know. And then they go back into another session and say, you know, I think I got a little bit comfortable. I got a little bit too into the moment, and I apologize for that. And so I'm going to pull back from that. And so that's a boundary and an opportunity to being able to model for somebody that, you know, I may have shared a little more than I wanted or needed to share with you. You're paying me. I'm not paying you, right? So somebody's talking about how difficult it is to not put themselves down, and making the client feel like they need to take care of me. I think this is something where it's really helpful to have some peer supervision with other people who know you, and sometimes recognizing that there may be some clients or some issues that you may be working on in your own work that may come up, and getting some supervision around that, and identifying this is probably not the time or place to share that, and noticing, you know, much like we do with clients when they're learning to do something different, what are some ways that this person can get some support in recognizing, you know, I really wanted to kind of find out, well, what movie did you go see on this, you know, this first date with this person? Because it's not really terribly pertinent a lot of times to the session. Oh goodness. So somebody here probably does not know that I'm a bit of a book nerd or a bibliophile. I had a very dear friend who told me that she was not ever going to help me move again because I had more books than things in my kitchen. There are so many great resources, and one of the things that I learned very early in my work as a therapist was reading and finding things that you enjoy that are related to the work that you do. Psychotherapy Networker has some great articles and just the whole gamut of things. And I remember when I first started working with adolescents, I read this great article of a woman who was working with an adolescent, and this adolescent just always made fun of her shoes because they were functional and not, you know, like old lady shoes, I think was the term that she used. And she worked with this client for a while, and you know, she wasn't always sure if it was a, you know, a great thing or if they made any real strides. And then 6 months or so down the line, another adolescent came in, and she found out that this teenager had been referred by the previous teenager, and she also commented on her shoes. And so I think sometimes finding things that help you to feel like, okay, I've made a mistake, or I'm not sure if this is working. And sometimes we get those messages that things maybe are working. We don't always get that immediate feedback, but sometimes if a person has referred another person to us because they're like, this person was really helpful for me. Okay. So somebody has a really good question. Biggest worry is feeling responsible for a client outside of a session, particularly related to suicide. And that's a really great question. And it's such a big issue right now. So much of what I think a lot of us are doing right now is safety planning with folks and being really clear about, it's important that we have a safety plan mapped out early in treatment, so that if someone does struggle with suicidal thoughts, what are the parameters for when I as a therapist am going to be like, okay, you were supposed to come to the appointment, you didn't, I called you, you didn't call me back, what do we do next? And being really clear, and that's where those really specific boundaries around it's important that you call back and that we have a safety plan, because I believe that the numbers for a lot of inpatient psychiatric facilities and residential treatment facilities have probably stayed pretty high throughout the pandemic, because a lot of people who were kind of teetering on the edge before the pandemic have all of these additional stressors, and it's been really difficult. So I think there's so many books. I could probably go on and on for days and days. Brene Brown, Lori Gottlieb, Irving Yalom, Bruce Perry. I really, and Scott Miller's books. I remember early in my career going to see Scott Miller of the Talking Cure talk, and he was showing some videos of sessions that he was doing with people. And it was such a breath of fresh air, because he showed a session and he stopped it and he looked at us and he says, and so if you were in this session, what would you do next? And so people talked about it for a minute, and he goes, yeah, that's not what I did. And then he showed us the rest of the video, and he's like, and being able to kind of tease apart what you would do differently is really something that we can all learn from, and being able to kind of see ourselves as we're figuring this out as we go, but having other people around you that you can get some supervision and consultation with is really, really helpful. But I think having a safety plan and being really clear about the resources in your area if someone is feeling suicidal. And I don't find that if someone is suicidal that they are not going to want to talk about it. I think that there's still that myth that if we talk with folks about suicide that we're going to cause them to want to, and I don't believe that's how that works. I think oftentimes people are feeling such despair that they sometimes have gone to work with a therapist who may not have a very wide window of tolerance, and that's where it can be helpful to be doing some of our own work and recognizing the importance of being able to hold that space. Because if someone comes into a session with me and if it feels like it's a lot bigger than what I can do, then I got a decision to make. I got to either figure out how to widen my window, get some supervision, learn about things. And I recently read an article, a woman who in the 90s had a new client come in, and she said it was about 7 months into their working together that this woman was displaying some dissociative identity disorder. At the time, it was called multiple personalities. And she kind of was freaking out as a therapist. And she said to the client, I'm going to need to refer you. And the client very clearly said, nope, I'm going to work with you. I've spent the past 7 months getting to know you. You're going to need to get more education and support around this, because we're going to do this together. And they ended up working together for 7 or 10 years, I think. But it was just something really interesting about that importance of that relationship and finding that comfort. And also sometimes we may not have that willingness to want to learn about those particular things, or it may be too close. Oh, here's a great question. I don't know if any of you struggle with imposter syndrome. I do. It's actually something that I think a lot of us struggle with, particularly for me when a situation comes up that is new and different and not something that I have encountered before, or when I feel like there's somebody else that would do this so much better than me. I think it's also something that a lot of us struggle with a lot of the time. And as Brene Brown talks about with feelings of shame, the more we talk about it, the less power it has over us. And I think it's really validating for folks to know that the people that sometimes we revere also struggle with imposter syndrome, because I think as a lot of us do our own work, we recognize that there is so much more to learn. And I remember thinking in my 30s, oh, I'm going to have it all figured out and da 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 da. And boy, there is so much more that I don't know. So, oh, I have more difficulties emotionally to start therapy with a new client. Okay, that's okay. Well, I think it might be helpful to check in with other people that you work with, and I'm curious if getting to know somebody new or feeling like that they might be sharing something that's a little bit beyond what you're doing, or maybe you're thinking that, like I did, that I was going to solve all of their problems in the first session and they weren't going to need to come back for a second one. So maybe it's some of those realistic expectations that sometimes it takes a while to get to know somebody for them to feel comfortable to talk with you about the things that are bothering them, because sometimes they don't even know. Um, how do you use your voice? Well, I think it kind of depends. How do you use your voice to help clients? That's a great question. I think one of the things that I will frequently do is encourage them to recognize that sometimes my voice might get much softer. Sometimes I might be a little more firm with things, but I'm not sure if it's my voice that I use as much with them as maybe encouraging them to recognize that they have a voice. Sometimes there are clients who really want somebody else to do all of the advocating for them, and that's not going to be super helpful in the long run if I'm always doing the advocating for someone. Um, oh gosh, how do I deal emotionally with the anxiety of starting with a new client? Well, for the first 6 months of working as a therapist, I did not consume caffeine before meeting with clients because my own anxiety got so high, and I, spent a lot of time getting supervision and really learning that I am creating and holding space for somebody to come in and talk about things that are really, really difficult. And sometimes it was just a matter of being in the room with them. And for some folks, that's really, really hard. Um, oh, good question. Are there specific techniques that you use to create rapport and trust? Um, Yeah, there actually are, and it's really interesting. Sometimes it's about noticing what somebody's wearing. I'm not sure if you guys can see the stuff behind me. I'm in someone else's office right now. Looking around some of the things in this office, you can probably tell a little bit about the person who offices here. San Francisco, UCLA, those kinds of things. Those are things that I notice. And if somebody is wearing a particular school logo or something, I may chit chat a little bit, or they may do that as well, just to get to know them, to help them feel comfortable. Because for a lot of people coming to therapy or coming into treatment, we sometimes meet them on or around one of the worst days of their life. And making eye contact for some folks is really helpful. For other folks, it's not. It can be very intimidating, and kind of gauging that. And I even sometimes will ask somebody. It's been really difficult not shaking hands with people. Oh my goodness, when working with a client, how do you know when you've opened up a box? I don't know that you always know when you've opened up a box. Sometimes noticing that something is coming up and gauging how the person is responding or reacting, and then kind of pausing or stopping in that moment, and maybe even identifying we're going to kind of pull back from that right now, and exploring if there are some ways that they can do some self-soothing or keeping themselves safe in that moment. Because I think sometimes trauma is one of those things that you're pulling on a piece of yarn and you continue to pull, and then the sweater is completely undone. So I think we are almost out of time. Oh, someone's talking about making some microaggressions. Mistakenly said something that can fall into a category. Okay. I think if you say or do something that could be considered a microaggression, I think providing some psychoeducation in that moment, and then identifying that you've just modeled for them, not that it was an intentional intervention, that was a microaggression, and that's something that you want to work on. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to really answer that question very, very thoroughly, but I think being able to identify and own when you've made a mistake, and if you're willing to make a commitment to do better, and then do that. Because sometimes people will say, well, yeah, I'll do better. And then if you continue to engage in those same behaviors, that may be a problem. So let's see. Oh gosh. You know, one of the things somebody asked here is about what do you do at the end of the session to find out whether or not something was helpful? And something that we do here periodically at Sierra Tucson is we will have feedback forms that somebody fills out at the end of the session. And it can be really helpful if a person fills that out and then you can either give it to you or give it to you anonymously. And then that could be something that you could be thinking about during the time between your next appointment, and then talk about that, because it's about figuring out, is this a relationship that's going to be helpful for me moving forward, and do I want to go forward with this relationship? Oh my goodness gracious, perfectionism. So if you haven't read anything by Brene Brown, that might be a good place to start. She talks about how perfectionism, shame, is the birthplace of perfectionism. And for those of us who struggle with perfectionism, we also struggle with shame. So I think that's a really great one. And someone also mentioned here, Why People Die by Suicide by Thomas Joyner is a book that's quite helpful in working with folks who struggle with suicidal thinking or suicidal thoughts and behaviors. Thank you all so very much for your time this morning and your wonderful questions. I really appreciate it.